Somewhere on the northern plains, in a country flat and white for as far as anyone could see, the nearest stand of trees could be a 3 days' walk away. No forest close by, no woodpile stacked against a wall, no cord of split logs waiting by the door, and the temperature outside was dropping toward 40 below zero. That's not an exaggeration for effect. In the winter of 1804, explorers, wintering among the Mandan and Hidatsa villages on the Missouri River, recorded a night that hit 44 degrees below zero, cold enough to crack a thermometer. So here's the real question. How do you keep a family alive through 5 months of that, in a country where the fuel you'd assume you need simply isn't there? The answer has almost nothing to do with building a bigger fire. And the strangest part of it, the detail that still catches people off guard when they hear it, we'll get to near the end. Survival on the northern plains didn't start with fire. It started months earlier, with a decision about where to spend the winter at all. The people who lived here, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara along the Missouri River, made the same calculation every autumn. Summer camps could sit out on the open grassland, exposed and wind-scoured. Winter camps could not. Families moved to river bottoms, to the wooded coulees and creek valleys, where cottonwood and willow grew thick enough to cut the wind and thick enough to burn. That move alone could change the felt temperature by a wide margin, out of a wind that never let up on the open grass and into air that actually held still. Getting fuel in a country this open was never simple, even down in those valleys, and every stand of timber near a village thinned out fast under the weight of that many households drawing on it winter after winter. Even people who had lived here for generations planned around it, not because they lacked the skill to build a bigger fire, but because they understood something a lot of us have forgotten. The fire was never going to be the thing that saved you, the site was. One of the clearest windows into that decision-making comes from a Hidatsa woman named Wahini, also known as Buffalo Bird Woman, who was born around 1839 in an earth lodge near the Knife River. Decades later, she told her life story in careful detail to an ethnographer named Gilbert Wilson, who spent 10 summers recording it. She remembered the fuel problem as something the older women thought about constantly, the driftwood that floated down the river, gathered and stored because a prairie winter didn't forgive a family that hadn't planned ahead. Her memory of it becomes the thread we're going to keep pulling on, because there's one detail near the end of her account that sounds almost impossible until you understand why it made complete sense. But before we get to that, you have to understand what these people actually built once they picked their site, because the shelter itself was doing more work than the fire ever could. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara built what are called earth lodges. Picture a circular, dome-shaped structure, sometimes 60 feet across, framed with heavy cottonwood timbers, and then buried entirely under a thick layer of packed earth and sod. From the outside, it looked less like a house and more like a low, grass-covered hill, with a smoke hole cut into the top and a covered entry tunnel on one side. That earth wasn't decoration. It was insulation, and it was extraordinary insulation. The ground itself, combined with the partially sunken floor, smoothed out the brutal temperature swings of the plains, the kind of place where summer could bake and winter could freeze a river solid. Snow that piled on top of the dome only added another layer of insulation on its own. One of these lodges could hold 30 to 50 people, several related families sharing the same space, the same central fire pit, the same warmth. Lewis and Clark wintering nearby in a log fort of their own making, wrote with real surprise about how comfortable these lodges stayed, even on the worst nights of that record cold snap. Their own fort, built from raw timber, never came close. That's the first piece of what made this possible. The building itself did most of the job the fire gets credit for, but a lodge that size still needed heat. And this is where no firewood stops being a simple line and starts being the actual daily problem these communities lived with.
Picture an actual day inside one of these lodges in the dead of January, because the routine tells you almost as much as the architecture does. Before sunrise, someone was already awake, coaxing the banked coals back into a small flame, feeding it slivers of dry wood or a chip of dried bison dung. Never more fuel than the moment needed. Smoke drifted up through the hole at the top, and cold morning air slid back down through that same opening. So whoever tended the fire worked fast, in the near dark, by feel as much as by sight. Meals through the coldest stretch were simple and repetitive. Corn mush, dried meat softened in hot water. Whatever the caches had to offer that week, eaten from wooden bowls with mussel shell spoons, because metal was scarce. Children played inside for days at a stretch when a storm sealed the entrance shut, and the older women worked constantly, scraping hides, mending moccasins, keeping the lodge itself in repair, since a gap in the earth covering was a heat leak nobody could afford. Wahine described this rhythm as ordinary rather than remarkable, the texture of an entire season rather than a crisis. And that's the detail worth sitting with. What looks, from the outside, like 5 months of siege against the cold was, from the inside, simply how a winter was lived, planned for so completely that the emergency never arrived. Out on the true open plains, away from the river bottoms, there was next to no wood at all. Settlers who arrived generations later ran into the exact same wall and wrote about it constantly, joking bitterly that on the plains, the wind draws the water and the cows cut the wood. Because the substitute, for settlers and for the native nations who'd been solving this problem for centuries longer, was the same thing: dried bison dung, buffalo chips, gathered and burned as fuel, because a fire built from chips threw fewer sparks than green wood, burned cleaner than people expect, and didn't require a single tree. It wasn't a last resort scraped together out of desperation. It was a known, planned for, reliable fuel source in a country that simply didn't grow trees the way people assume it should. And inside a well-built lodge, you didn't need a roaring fire anyway. You needed a small one, kept low, banked down to a bed of coals overnight, so it would still be alive and easy to build back up by morning, rather than burned hot and fast and wastefully. Fuel conservation wasn't an afterthought out here, it was a skill, taught the same way hunting was taught. Now, it's worth pausing on something, because Native American is doing a lot of work in that phrase, and it's covering a lot of very different winters. Not every nation was fighting the exact same fight. Up around the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe peoples had the opposite problem. They lived surrounded by forest, and firewood was never in short supply. One elder, named Nodinans, recalling her own childhood winter camps, described 6 families moving deep into the woods together, splitting wood and keeping it in a small shed by the door so it stayed dry through the night. Their winter home was a wigwam, a dome-shaped frame of bent saplings covered in birch bark and woven cattail mats. And when they set up camp, the men shoveled the snow away to clear the ground and then banked the outside walls with evergreen boughs and more snow, packed tight against the base. That snow wasn't a nuisance to clear and forget.
It was doing the same job the Earth was doing on a Missouri River lodge 600 miles to the west, sealing the gaps, blocking the wind, holding the heat a small fire produced inside a small space, so that even with a full woodpile sitting right outside the door, the family still barely needed to burn much of it. Further out on the open plains, nomadic buffalo hunting nations like the Lakota carried a third solution entirely: a teepee, portable enough to strike and move in under an hour, with an inner lining of hide hung a foot or so inside the outer cover to trap a layer of still, warming air between the two, and dried grass packed along the base in winter for exactly the same sealing effect. 3 completely different building methods. 3 completely different relationships with the forest around them. And underneath every one of them, the exact same engineering instinct. Trap the air, block the wind. Let the structure do the work the fire alone never could. Here's the thing though, even with the shelter engineered right and the fuel problem solved, the cold outside the walls could still kill a person in a single afternoon. And the way these communities managed that risk is where this story turns dangerous fast. Mandan and Hidatsa hunters routinely went out for days at a time in temperatures that would put most modern people in a hospital, and often without carrying fire at all. What they carried instead was clothing built for exactly this: antelope hide leggings, a shirt, a heavy buffalo robe worn hair side in against the body so the animal's own insulation was doing double duty, moccasins lined with fur, packed loose enough to keep blood moving through the toes rather than squeezing it out. Layered correctly, that combination could keep a person alive through a night spent completely in the open. No shelter, no flame, nothing but hide between a human body and air that could freeze exposed skin in minutes.
There's a specific kind of cold that stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a physical weight pressing against the chest. And every hunter who worked this country learned to read that feeling before it became dangerous. But the margin for error was razor thin, and the historical record has a sobering example of exactly what happened when it wasn't enough. In January of 1805, a young man from one of the villages came in from a hunting trip with severe frostbite, having spent a night out in temperatures near 40 below. He lost the toes on one foot. Then, days later, the toes on the other. Meanwhile, a different man who'd also stayed out that same freezing night, thinly dressed, but dressed correctly, walked away with no injury at all. Same cold, same night. The difference wasn't luck. It was knowledge, passed down and practiced, about exactly how many layers, which materials, and how tightly wrapped a body needed to be to survive direct contact with air that cold. So the clothing kept a person alive outside. But there was a deeper problem underneath all of this that had nothing to do with temperature. And it's the one modern people almost never think of first. Staying warm, it turns out, is mostly a math problem about calories. A human body generates its own heat by burning fuel, and in brutal cold, that furnace runs hot, demanding far more energy just to hold a normal temperature than it would on an ordinary day, which meant the real enemy of a plains winter wasn't the wind chill. It was running out of food before spring arrived. This is exactly why pemmican existed. Making it started in late summer, when women sliced fresh bison meat into thin strips and hung it on wooden racks to dry in the sun and wind until it turned brittle and dark. That dried meat was pounded down on a hide spread across the ground until it was close to powder. It was mixed in roughly equal parts with rendered fat and often dried berries for both flavour and a dose of vitamin C, then packed tight into a rawhide bag, sewn shut, where it would keep, essentially indefinitely, without spoiling or needing so much as a root cellar. A single pound of it carried around 3,000 calories, more than 4 times the density of the same weight of ordinary meat. Dense enough that a family could carry a winter's worth of food without needing a wagon to move it. One bison, properly processed, could fill a bag weighing close to 90 pounds. Families like Wahini's didn't rely on meat alone either. The Hidatsa were skilled farmers as well as hunters, growing corn, beans and squash through the summer and drying the surplus for winter, stored in deep, bell-shaped pits dug right into the lodge floor, hidden beneath the same roof that was keeping the cold out. Between the pemmican and the cached harvest, a household wasn't just planning to survive the cold, they were stockpiling the fuel their own bodies would need to fight it, for 5 straight months, without a single trip to resupply. Now here's where all of this comes together, because the most surprising part of how these communities got through the hardest winters wasn't a technique at all. It was a decision about who and what got to share the warmth. An earth lodge wasn't built to hold one family in isolation. It held several, and it held their animals too. Wahini described her own father stabling his hunting ponies inside the lodge at night, sharing the same warmed air the family slept in. Archaeological and historical accounts from the Knife River villages describe a community of over 100 lodges that, together, housed close to 1,000 people, along with hundreds of dogs and horses, all wintering inside those earth-covered domes. Every one of those animals was giving off body heat. Dogs curled near the fire pit and ponies stabled along the outer wall. All of it trapped inside the same insulated space that was already holding warmth so well that Lewis and Clark couldn't stop writing about it in their own journals. It sounds almost too strange to be practical, sharing your living room with your horse for 5 months straight. But once you understand the math, the calorie cost of losing an animal to a cold snap, the heat a large body gives off simply by being alive, it stops sounding strange and starts sounding like the smartest possible use of a space they'd already built. Nothing generating warmth went to waste out here. Not the fire, not the bodies packed into the room, not even the livestock. That communal instinct is really the answer underneath everything else in this story, because the hardest winters these communities faced were never just about temperature. Wahini's own life began, by her account, 3 years after the smallpox winter, a devastating epidemic that swept through the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in the early 1780s and again decades later, killing enormous numbers of people and forcing survivors to abandon settlements and consolidate into fewer, smaller, more defensible ones. Surviving the cold meant very little if the community itself couldn't recover from what else arrived with contact. Villages that had held 1,000 people were reduced to a fraction of that within a single season, and the survivors buried their dead in a country where the ground itself was frozen solid for months at a time. And yet the villages did rebuild, generation after generation, refining the same lodge design, the same fuel strategy, the same instinct to share every scrap of warmth a community produced, and passing every piece of it down through exactly the kind of oral account Wahini gave to Gilbert Wilson decades later, sitting with an interpreter in a language he barely spoke, describing a childhood most of his readers could barely imagine living through. None of what kept these communities alive was improvised in the moment. It was inherited knowledge, tested against the worst winters a continent could produce, refined by people who had no margin for a mistake and made astonishingly few of them. So, if you pictured the answer to how they survived with no firewood, as some heroic fire kept burning against impossible odds, that's not really what the record shows. What actually happened was quieter, and a good deal more impressive than that. A campsite chosen months in advance for its access to timber or shelter from wind. A building engineered, whether from earth, bark or hide, to hold heat with almost no fuel at all. A backup fuel source most people today have never heard of. Clothing precise enough that the difference between two men on the same freezing night was frostbite for one and nothing at all for the other. Food stockpiled with the specific understanding that staying warm and staying fed were the same problem wearing two different faces. And a decision made over and over across generations to share every bit of warmth a community produced, human or animal, rather than let any of it go to waste. That's not a story about enduring the cold. That's a story about outthinking it, region by region, generation by generation, until survival stopped being a matter of luck and became a matter of design. Which raises a question worth sitting with after all this. None of what you just heard came from luck, or from toughness alone, or from some mystical harmony with nature that people like to project onto the past. It came from generations of people testing what worked, discarding what didn't, and teaching the difference to their children with real consequences attached to getting it wrong. We live surrounded by thermostats and insulated walls and heating bills we barely think twice about. And most of us would not last a single one of those nights on our own, dressed in whatever we had, with nothing but a bed of coals and a stranger's calculations standing between us and 40 below. Was the world these communities built actually harder to live in than ours, or just differently earned, paid for in knowledge instead of dollars? If any part of this surprised you, the earth lodge holding heat better than a log fort, the ponies sharing the room, the frostbite story, drop it in the comments and let me know which one. There's a lot more where this came from.